The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum at 5:19 a.m. when Brooke Sullivan pushed through the employee entrance of Oak Creek Memorial, her badge swinging from a lanyard that had frayed 3 years ago. Nobody asked why a floor nurse moved through the ICU corridors with the careful precision of someone who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible. Nobody asked about the slight hesitation in her left leg, the way her weight shifted a fraction of a second before that foot touched ground. Nobody asked, and she didn't volunteer. The antiseptic smell of the hospital wrapped around her like a familiar coat, bleach and saline and something metallic underneath. Her shift started in 14 minutes, and she had the kind of routine that required no variation: check the assignment board, review overnight notes, prepare the equipment, speak to no one unless spoken to. The night had been quiet. Too quiet. The ICU held 6 patients at 5:52 a.m., 3 cardiac monitors, 1 ventilator, 2 stable, and the skeleton crew of third shift was already thinking about breakfast. Brooke moved past the nurse's station without looking at anyone, her scrubs a shade of blue that blended into the walls, her movements the kind that didn't draw attention. This was a skill she had perfected over 7 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Invisibility. She had learned to be the nurse that people forgot was in the room, the one who showed up at 5:38 a.m. and left at 3:24 p.m. and filled the hours between with work that needed doing. Double shifts were common. Triple shifts happened. Once, she had worked 41 consecutive hours during a flu outbreak, and when it was over, the day shift supervisor had simply nodded and moved on. That was the kind of nurse Brooke Sullivan had become. The ICU smelled different on this particular morning. Not worse. Different. There was a tension in the air, the kind that preceded something, though she couldn't have said what. She pulled up the patient roster on the computer terminal, and her eyes caught on a name that made something in her chest stop moving for exactly 1 second. Admiral James Hartwell. Admitted at 2:17 a.m. Cardiac monitoring. Stable rhythm. The name meant something. Not in the way that most names meant something, with a story attached or a face attached. This name was attached to a letterhead. She had seen it once, on an official envelope, back when her son had received his deployment orders to Helmand Province. Hartwell's signature had been at the bottom of that page, small and precise, the kind of signature that belonged to someone who had signed thousands of things and no longer paid attention to what he was signing. Brooke's hand moved to her throat without her permission. The dog tag there was half hidden by her collar, on a chain that had broken 2 years ago and had never been properly repaired. She had just tied the ends together, a loop of silver chain holding a single piece of metal. The other one was gone. It had gone into the ground 18 months ago, and she had decided that one was enough. One was all she could carry. Her fingers brushed the edge of it, just for a moment, and then she put her hand back down and pulled up the Admiral's chart. 68 years old. Cardiac arrhythmia history. Scheduled for a routine procedure this morning. 2 adult children. No notes about allergies, no flag for anything unusual. Just an old man coming to a hospital for the kind of thing old men came to hospitals for. She prepared for her shift the way she always did. Check the ventilator settings on room 4, stable, no changes needed. Review the medication log for room 2, heart medication, nothing unusual. Walk the floor, review the monitors, make sure nothing was beeping that shouldn't be beeping. The hospital was waking up around her in increments. At 6:15 a.m., the day shift started trickling in. By 6:19 a.m., the corridors had that particular energy that came with the shift change, nurses from the night crew giving report to nurses from the day crew, voices pitched low but filled with the relief of being almost done. Brooke moved through it all like a ghost. She had reports of her own to give, but she gave them in the break room to the day shift nurses who were assigned to take over her patients, speaking in flat sentences, no inflection. Room 1, Admiral Hartwell, stable rhythm, no events overnight. Continue current protocol. The day shift nurses nodded and moved on. Nobody asked questions. Nobody ever asked Brooke Sullivan questions beyond what was strictly required by protocol. She didn't think this was anything unusual. She thought this was how it worked. You were invisible when you wanted to be invisible. You did your job. You went home. It was 7:08 a.m. when Dr. Caldwell arrived on the ICU floor, and the entire energy of the room shifted. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps heavier than they needed to be, his voice carrying across the nurse's station in a way that suggested he believed that everyone should hear him. He was tall, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been athletic and had maintained it through discipline rather than through any particular love of exercise. His suit was expensive, she could tell by the way it hung, the fabric too fine to be off the rack, and his shoes were polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights. He moved through the ICU the way someone moves through a space they own, and it was clear that he believed he owned this space entirely. "I'll be taking the Admiral's primary care," he announced to the day shift residents, not asking, simply declaring. His voice was the kind that came from a chest full of certainty, the kind that suggested the world had never said no to him and he had no reason to believe it would start now. "All communications regarding his care go through me. All decisions regarding his treatment go through me. I will be performing the procedure myself at 9 a.m. Any questions?" There were no questions. There were never questions when Dr. Caldwell made announcements. Brooke was at the supply cabinet at the far end of the unit, restocking the crash cart for the day shift, when she first actually saw him. She watched from the corner of her vision as he approached the Admiral's room, clipboard in hand, the kind of purposeful stride that belonged to someone who had never once wondered if they belonged somewhere. He didn't glance left or right. He didn't see the floor nurse in the corner with her hands full of tubing and cardiac leads. He didn't see anything except his patient and his own reflection in the glass partition between the rooms. This was fine. This was normal. Brooke finished restocking the cart and rolled it into its proper place, each item exactly where it should be, each item exactly where she had learned to keep it. At 8:14 a.m., the cardiac monitor in room 3 registered something that shouldn't be registering. Brooke heard it first, that particular tone that meant the rhythm had changed in a way that required immediate attention. She was moving before any conscious thought completed itself, her hands already reaching for the call bell, her feet already carrying her into the room. The patient was a 46-year-old man with a history of cardiac issues, and he was going into something approximating a rapid ventricular response, his heart beating too fast, the rhythm wrong in ways that made every nerve ending in Brooke's body sing. Nurses were converging on the room now, called by the monitor, but they were moving with the kind of urgency that came with panic. Brooke's hands, though, were steady. She grabbed the emergency cart, the one she had just finished stocking 18 minutes ago, and positioned herself at the patient's left side, and when Dr. Caldwell arrived, she was already assessing, already preparing, already moving with the kind of muscle memory that had nothing to do with being a floor nurse at Oak Creek Memorial. "Get me a 12 lead," she said to the resident, her voice low and level. 12 lead EKG, I want to see what we're dealing with." The resident moved. When you spoke with certainty like that, people moved. She already knew what the EKG would show, she could hear it in the monitor, could read the arrhythmia in the sound alone, but protocol required the confirmation. Protocol required evidence. She was sliding the leads onto the patient's chest with a speed that suggested she had done this more than a few times, and by the time Dr. Caldwell was standing in the doorway with his expression arranged in a careful mask of professional concern, the EKG was printing and Brooke was already calculating dosages in her head, her fingers moving with the fluid precision of apex predators, of hands that had learned long ago that hesitation was the same as failure. "Administer 150 milligrams of amiodarone 4, Caldwell said, and Brooke was already reaching for the medication before he had finished the sentence. She was drawing it up, finding the line, pushing the medication through with the kind of care that came from knowing exactly what would happen in the next 30 seconds. The patient's rhythm didn't change immediately. 30 seconds ticked by. Then 45. Then the monitor shifted, the rapid ventricular response collapsing into something that resembled normalcy, something that resembled a rhythm that could sustain a human life for another day. "Good work," Caldwell said, speaking to the room in general, to no one in particular. He was walking back out of the room already, his hand already on his phone, his mind already moving on to whatever came next. "Continue monitoring. Page me if there are any further events." Nobody thanked Brooke. Nobody asked her how she had known to move so quickly, how she had anticipated each step before Caldwell had articulated it. The day shift nurses moved away from the crash cart, stepping back to their regular stations, their regular rhythms. Brooke stood there for a moment, her left leg burning slightly with the effort of the last 5 minutes, and then she reached down and adjusted the compression sleeve under her scrubs, the one nobody was supposed to see, the one that kept the rebuilt leg functional, and she went back to work. The day shift supervisor passed her in the corridor at 8:27 a.m. "Good catch," she said, and kept walking. That was as close to praise as anyone at Oak Creek Memorial had ever gotten with Brooke Sullivan. It was enough. It had to be enough. Admiral Hartwell's room was dark when she did her 9 a.m. check, just before Caldwell was scheduled to begin the procedure. She moved in quietly, her hand steady as she checked the monitor readout, confirmed the 4 lines, verified that everything was in the state it should be in. The Admiral was asleep, sedated before the procedure, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger than 68, or perhaps just more human. She touched the dog tag at her throat again, just for a moment, just long enough to remind herself that this was a patient. Just another patient. Just another name. Just another person who required her attention and her precision and her ability to move through crisis without flinching. She had no idea what was about to happen. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial always felt like a performance, and today the audience was important. Admiral James Hartwell's wife sat in the chair beside his bed, her posture rigid as polished steel, her eyes tracking every movement in the room. Their daughter stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, the kind of protective stance that came from military families, people who understood hierarchy and accountability in ways civilians never quite grasped. Brooke moved through her checks with the precision she always used, vitals logged, for lines inspected, drainage tubes measured and documented in the chart with the kind of meticulous attention that came from 18 years of catching what others missed. Dr. Caldwell swept in at 8:02 a.m., his white coat pressed with geometric precision, his stethoscope positioned like a status symbol across his shoulders. He didn't acknowledge Brooke. He rarely did anymore, though his eyes flicked toward her for a fraction of a second, the way you might glance at a piece of furniture that had disappointed you. "Admiral Hartwell," he said, his voice smooth as expensive leather. "How are we feeling this morning?" The "we" was intentional. It positioned him alongside the patient, not the nurse. Brooke had heard variations of this technique 100 times. It was a power move dressed in false intimacy. She pulled the chart from the holder at the foot of the bed and began her review of the orders Caldwell had written during the night shift. Blood pressure medication, appropriate dosage. Anticoagulation protocol, standard for post-admission cardiac patients. But on the 4th line, her eyes caught on something that made her breath catch. Caldwell had ordered metoprolol 50 mg twice daily. Routine beta blocker for heart rate management. Except the Admiral's chart, filed in the system from his intake 3 hours ago, clearly documented an allergy notation, metoprolol, severe reaction, prior admission, documented rash and bronchospasm. Brooke had seen enough adverse drug events to know what came next if that medication went in: airway compromise, anaphylaxis, emergency intubation. Muscle memory wasn't just physical. It was clinical. It was the voice that spoke inside her head during every single shift, the one that said, check, verify, question what doesn't fit. She moved closer to Caldwell, her voice low and measured, aimed only at him, a courtesy, a respect for hierarchy that she extended automatically. "Doctor, the Admiral's chart shows his on." Caldwell turned before she finished the sentence. His eyes met hers and something cold moved behind them, a calculation that took approximately 0.8 seconds. He was deciding whether to acknowledge her or dismiss her. Brooke watched him choose the latter. "Nurse Sullivan, perhaps you've forgotten your place in this hospital's chain of command." His voice carried the texture of ice water, clean, precise, designed to sting without leaving marks. He turned to the Admiral's wife and daughter with an apologetic smile, the kind a man wearing a $400 tie gives when forced to explain an inconvenient lower-ranking employee. "Please excuse our floor nurse. She has a tendency to overstep." He said it like she had a behavioral problem. Like correcting a medication that would send the Admiral into anaphylaxis was equivalent to forgetting to refill the ice machine. The Admiral's daughter's eyes narrowed. She understood protocols. She understood chains of command. But she also understood medicine, and something in her expression suggested she was running the same calculation Brooke's mind had already completed. Her mother's jaw tightened. They were listening. They were understanding. Brooke took one measured breath. She didn't argue. She didn't list the allergies or cite the patient safety guidelines or pull out her phone to show him the documented reaction from 3 years ago. Instead, she let the silence expand for exactly 2 seconds, and then she spoke quietly, each word placed with the precision of someone disarming a device. I hope you never need someone like me when policy isn't enough. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't move. But a single tear escaped, not from emotion, but from the pressure of holding everything back, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. Let him see her composure. Let him see that his contempt had registered and was being filed away. Caldwell's face darkened. The red climbed from his collar like a rash, his shoulders stiffening. My office. Now. He gestured toward the door with a movement that carried the weight of dismissal. Before he turned away, his gaze snagged on something at the base of her neck, the dog-tag chain, broken at its clasp, hanging against her collarbone where she'd pinned it beneath her scrubs. It caught the light for a fraction of a second. He looked at it the way a man looks at a piece of trash on the floor of his car, noted, dismissed, never questioned. He had no framework for understanding why a civilian nurse would wear a single military identification tag. Sentiment, probably. Something she'd bought at a gift shop. He turned away without asking. The next 3 hours moved through Brooke like a current she'd learned to swim through years ago. She completed her assigned rounds on the other patients in her section. She documented vital signs. She changed dressings on 2 post-op wounds with the kind of mechanical precision that came from doing something 10,000 times. She thought about the metoprolol order sitting in the electronic system, unsigned, waiting for the pharmacy to flag it or for someone, anyone, to catch it before it became a crisis. At 11:32 a.m., she sat in the break room with her coffee. Black, no sugar. The same thing she'd drunk at 5:33 a.m. before she'd come in, and at 2:41 p.m. yesterday, and at every shift for the past 2 years. The coffee was a ritual. It was the one thing she controlled. She sat in the corner chair, the one where she could see the door, a habit that had never fully left even though she was no longer in a theater where doorways meant threats. 3 nurses from the morning shift were gathered at the table near the window, their voices low, their body language the kind of closed formation that meant they were discussing something they didn't want overheard. They glanced at her when she sat down. The glance was quick. Professional. But then one of them, Sarah, who'd been friendly enough during afternoon overlaps, began gathering her things. The other 2 followed. Within 18 seconds, the break room emptied except for Brooke and the fluorescent light above her head, which made a sound like insects trapped in plastic. She stared into her coffee and saw her own reflection staring back, fractured by steam. By 1:08 p.m., the physical manifestation of her professional status appeared in the main corridor outside the administrative office. A bulletin board hung there, the kind that usually displayed schedule changes and infection control reminders. Today it displayed a write-up, printed on hospital letterhead, with her name at the top in bold, Sullivan, insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. The words underneath were clinical and damning. Dr. Caldwell's signature was precise, his handwriting the kind that came from expensive schools and confidence that extended into areas he had no business confidence inhabiting. Other staff moved past the board throughout the afternoon. Some read it. Some pretended not to notice it was there. A few stopped, their eyes flicking toward her station, the quick look of confirmation that yes, the rumors were true, yes, something had happened, yes, the new girl had finally overstepped and paid the price. Caldwell appeared at approximately 2:15 p.m., standing near the bulletin board with his arms crossed, the kind of posture that suggested he'd timed his arrival to coincide with her awareness of the write-up. His voice projected across the hallway with the precision of a man secure in his institutional power. "A floor nurse," he said, loud enough for nurses passing with med carts to hear, "has no business near a patient of the Admiral's caliber. Some people need to understand their limitations." He was looking at her. Everyone could see he was looking at her. Brooke simply turned away from the bulletin board and limped down the corridor toward the medication dispensary. Her left leg, the one that had never quite healed right after Helmand, pulled slightly as she moved, a remnant that never fully disappeared, just managed itself in the background like chronic pain nobody talked about. She didn't respond to Caldwell. She didn't defend herself. She just walked, one foot in front of the other, the way she'd learned to walk when half her world had disappeared and the rest of it demanded she keep moving. What she didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, alarm bells would begin screaming through the ICU wing. What she didn't know was that the routine cardiac catheterization scheduled for the Admiral would become a code blue that Dr. Caldwell would freeze during, his hands shaking as the patient's vitals collapsed. What she didn't know was that her refusal to fight back, her composure in the face of public humiliation, had been observed by a Navy lieutenant who'd been visiting his father's room and had watched the entire exchange. What none of them knew was that Brooke Sullivan's restraint wasn't weakness. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that the world could deliver. The cardiac catheterization lab was scheduled for 10:38 a.m. on a Tuesday. Routine procedure, the kind that happened at Oak Creek Memorial 3 times a week. A Navy admiral with a history of arrhythmia, a blocked left circumflex artery, a straightforward intervention. Caldwell had reserved the lab himself, made it clear in the morning briefing that he would be handling the case personally. He didn't look at Brooke when he said it. She was restocking the supply cart on the second floor when the announcement went out. She heard it through the overhead speaker, muffled but precise, "Cardiac Cath Lab, 10:53. The words didn't land the way they might have for someone else. She kept counting vials. 1, 2, 3. Her hands didn't shake. They never did anymore. By 11:15, the nursing assignments had been redistributed. The OR coordinator, Chen, approached her with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "Caldwell's got a restricted access list for the Admiral's case," Chen said quietly, not making eye contact. "You're pulled from critical support rotation. You'll be on general floor coverage instead." Brooke nodded once. She'd expected as much. The humiliation the day before had done its work, not to break her, but to isolate her. Caldwell was building architecture. He was removing her from the board so carefully that when something went wrong, she couldn't be there to fix it. Strategic. Competent. The work of someone who understood power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. At 11:54 a.m., she was at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, charting on a post-op patient, when the first alarm sounded from the procedure room 7 floors below. Not the standard alert. The kind of alarm that made every nurse in the hospital know, without being told, that someone's heart had stopped beating the way it should. The overhead crackled. Code blue. Cardiac Cath Lab. Code blue. Brooke's hand stilled on the keyboard. She didn't move. Didn't reach for the intercom or the stairwell door. She sat very still and listened to the hospital pivot toward crisis like a living thing. Pages went out. Rapid response was called. The ER was mobilizing. But she could feel it already, the shape of what was happening below. She'd spent 8 years reading the precise geometry of medical disaster. She knew what a crash during a cardiac catheterization looked like. She knew the differential, perforation, tamponade, massive bleed, the balloon that had swollen too large and punctured the arterial wall. She knew because she'd treated worse in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley while the mountains echoed with incoming rounds. She stood up. "Where are you going?" Chen asked from across the station. "Bathroom," Brooke said flatly. She was walking toward the stairwell when the second alarm sounded, not a code alert this time, but the raw distress signal of a monitor flatline. She'd heard that sound in her sleep for 3 years after she came home. She knew what it meant. She also knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had seen death work, that Caldwell was probably still staring at the monitor instead of acting. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. She walked down the stairwell with her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her mind already in the procedure room 3 floors below. The descent took 40 seconds. Her legs remembered the geography: 3rd floor exit, corridor toward cardiology, the swinging doors that separated the main hospital from the interventional suite. The procedure room door was sealed. Through the glass, she could see them: Caldwell standing rigid near the imaging equipment, his hand raised in a gesture of shock or indecision. 2 surgical techs and a resident stood frozen, their movements suspended like a photograph. On the table, the Admiral's chest was exposed, and his monitor showed a line so flat it might have been drawn with a ruler. Cardiac tamponade. She saw it instantly: the distended neck veins, the pale cyanotic coloring of the face, the absolute absence of output. His pericardium was full of blood. His heart was being strangled by its own fluids. Minutes. That was all he had left. The door wasn't locked. Protocols required restricted access, but in a code, the assumption was that people were supposed to help. Brooke pushed through and moved to the table. "Where's the tray?" Her voice didn't sound like it belonged to anyone who'd been humiliated in a hospital corridor the day before. It sounded like it belonged to someone who'd made decisions that kept men alive. The surgical tech didn't hesitate. Didn't question. She was younger, maybe 3 years out of her certification, and she'd been trained her entire career to trust that tone of voice. She slid the emergency tray forward. Caldwell's voice came late, crackling with fury and confusion. "Nurse Sullivan, step away from that patient right now or I will have security." Brooke had already made the first incision. The scalpel bit clean through skin and subcutaneous tissue. She worked in the space where chaos usually lived, and she moved through it like someone conducting a ballet. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. The blade opened the chest cavity with the kind of decisive precision that took years of field work to develop, years that Caldwell would never question too closely because he wouldn't want to know. She could see the pericardium beneath, the fluid-filled sac suffocating the heart. There was no time for gloves. There was no time for protocol. "Needle," she said. A resident handed it forward. She aspirated the blood, the dark fluid that rushed out like a confession, and the Admiral's pressure shot up on the monitor like someone had thrown a switch. 79, 92. 104, the line began to dance again. The room went dead silent except for the monitors. The steady blip of a heart finding its rhythm again. Sinus rhythm. Strong. The kind of response that took 2 minutes and a person who knew exactly where to cut. Brooke stepped back. Her gloves were slick with blood. Her scrubs were spotted with it. Her breathing was steady, like she'd just walked down a hallway instead of having just crossed some threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Caldwell stared at her. His face moved through shock into something harder, a kind of focused fury that came from understanding, in that single moment, that he'd made a calculation that was going to cost him. "Everyone out," he said quietly. The surgical team moved like they'd been waiting for permission. The resident, the techs, the nurses, they filed out without looking at Brooke. Door swung closed. The Admiral lay sedated and stable on the table, his chest exposed, the pericardium drained, his vital signs climbing toward normal. Caldwell turned to face her fully. His voice when it came was the kind of calm that predators use before they strike. "You just ended your career. That was an unsanctioned procedure. I'm pulling your credentials immediately. You performed surgery without authorization. You contaminated a sterile field. You overstepped your scope of practice in the most catastrophic possible way." "He was going to die," Brooke said quietly. "That's not your decision to make." Caldwell moved toward his phone, his movements precise, controlled, the movement of someone who knew how to dismantle people using institutional power like a scalpel. "Security will escort you out of this building within the hour. I'm contacting the Oregon Board of Nursing today. I'm filing a formal complaint with hospital administration. And I'm documenting this entire incident as a deliberate breach of protocol that endangered a VIP patient." Brooke didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the procedure room, her blood-stained gloves still in her hands, her scrubs marked with evidence of what she'd just done. The next 48 hours moved with the precision of a planned assault. By 1:27 p.m., her supporting staff had been quietly reassigned. The 2 nurses she'd worked closely with on critical cases were transferred to the pediatric unit. By 2:45 p.m., her schedule had been altered. She was pulled from the trauma rotation and moved to discharge planning and patient intake. Graveyard shift. Isolation. By 4:44 p.m., the first phone call had gone out. She overheard Caldwell in his office speaking to someone on the hospital board, his voice carefully modulated, his words chosen with surgical precision. "Yes, I'm concerned about liability. Yes, I've documented the incident. She has no credentials for surgical intervention. She has no privileges. And frankly, I'm concerned about her stability. The decision-making wasn't rational. It was impulsive. I think we need to consider whether she's emotionally equipped to work in this environment." But that wasn't the worst part. The thoracotomy had taken 4 minutes. Caldwell spent the next 48 hours trying to bury it. He moved through the hospital like a man who had calculated every angle. First came the credential suspension, a single page printed on hospital letterhead, dated and signed while the Admiral still had a pulse monitor reading his stabilized rhythm. Unsanctioned procedures. Scope of practice violation. A floor nurse with no surgical authorization performing an invasive emergency intervention. Caldwell's words were precise, clinical, the language of someone who had weaponized policy before. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power doesn't have to shout. By noon the next day, Brooke's assigned support staff had been quietly reassigned. The surgical tech who usually prepped the Admiral's morning vitals was transferred to the orthopedic ward. Her nursing assistant got moved to pediatrics. The phlebotomist who drew labs at dawn was suddenly working nights. It wasn't dramatic. It was systematic. Like watching someone remove the screws from a chair one at a time, waiting to see when the person sitting in it would finally fall. Caldwell altered her schedule in the computer system without informing her. She arrived for her 7 a.m. shift and found herself reassigned to the basement storage inventory, a meaningless busywork task that kept her away from any critical patient. The next day, she was scheduled for 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., graveyard shift, when the Admiral would be sleeping and when any medical crisis would require her to move through a hospital skeleton crew. The day after that, she wasn't on the schedule at all. Just a gap. Like she was already gone. The phone call started at 3 p.m. on the 3rd day after the thoracotomy. Brooke heard about them later, in fragments passed through the hospital's gossip channels, Caldwell's voice in conference rooms with board members, carefully worded concerns about liability exposure. A nurse with questionable judgment. Possible emotional instability. The use of non-standard equipment in unauthorized procedures suggested a pattern of concerning behavior. He never said she'd saved the Admiral's life. He said she'd violated protocol during a moment of crisis, and when a nurse couldn't follow the chain of command, who knew what she might do next? One board member had asked if there was documentation of prior incidents. Caldwell said he was still investigating, but the pattern was becoming clear. His tone suggested he was doing them all a favor by pursuing this quietly rather than involving legal. Brooke worked what shifts remained, moving through the hospital like a ghost. The staff who had watched her perform the thoracotomy didn't meet her eyes anymore. The tension was different now, not the cold weight of dismissal, but something heavier. Pity, maybe. Or fear. Fear that association with her might taint them too. On her final shift before the suspension hearing, she was assigned to the Admiral's room at 5 a.m. Caldwell hadn't explicitly forbidden it. He didn't need to. The message was already clear. Let her see what she'd done. Let her see the man she'd saved lying there, knowing that saving him had cost her everything. The Admiral was awake when she entered. His eyes tracked her movement from the doorway to his bedside with the focused intensity of someone still accustomed to reading threats. His breathing was shallow but steady. The chest tube was draining clear fluid now. His color had improved. Every metric said he was going to survive. Brooke had saved him, and now she was going to lose her career. She checked the monitor first, sinus rhythm, solid and reliable. BP 118/72. O2 sat 96% on room air. Everything normal. Everything good. She reached for his wrist to check his pulse manually, a small gesture of continuity that nurses made thousands of times a day. This time, it felt like saying goodbye. The Admiral's hand moved. Not away, but toward her. His fingers brushed the dog tag chain at her neck where it had come loose from beneath her scrubs. Just one tag. The one that belonged to Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Chen, the medic she couldn't save in Helmand Province. The one she'd carried for 12 years. Major Sullivan. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. But his eyes were clear. Certain. The room tilted. Her hands went completely still. Helmand Province, he continued. 2012, the field hospital at FOB Shank. You were, he paused, studying her face like he was confirming something he'd only read in after-action reports. You held that position alone. 63 Marines. 11 hours under fire. Brooke's hand moved to his arm, gentle pressure, the motion of a nurse managing an agitated patient. But her voice came out quieter than she intended. Admiral, you need to rest. I know who you are, he said. The certainty in his voice made her chest seize. She had rebuilt herself for 12 years on the principle that no one would ever know. That she could be anonymous enough, quiet enough, invisible enough that the past would stay buried. She'd worked double shifts and never mentioned her hands. She'd worn her scrubs like armor against recognition. She'd let Dr. Caldwell humiliate her without fighting back because fighting back meant drawing attention, and attention meant exposure. And now, here in a quiet ICU room at 5:16 a.m., the one person who could expose her was looking at her with something that might have been respect. The footsteps in the hallway came from 3 different directions almost simultaneously. Caldwell pushed through the door first, his lab coat pristine, his expression arranged into something between concern and triumph. Behind him came 2 hospital security officers in their grey uniforms, and a woman in a blue HR jacket carrying a manila folder. Nurse Sullivan. Caldwell's voice had the smooth confidence of someone who had already won. Your suspension is now effective immediately. We've discovered significant irregularities in your employment records. He held up the folder. Brooke recognized it, the one that had been sitting on his desk 2 days ago. Whatever was in those pages, he believed it was enough. You'll surrender your credential badge and your hospital ID immediately, Caldwell continued. You'll be escorted from the premises. If you attempt to access hospital systems or facilities without authorization, security will be notified and local law enforcement will be contacted. He paused, letting that settle. This is for the safety of our patients and staff. The Admiral made a sound, not quite words, but the beginning of something that Caldwell cut off with a raised hand. Sir, please don't agitate yourself. This situation is being handled appropriately. This employee violated multiple protocols and demonstrated judgment that we can't tolerate in this environment. Brooke removed her badge. The laminated rectangle with her photo came free from its clip at her waist with a small snapping sound. The dog tag chain pulled free from her collar as she moved, that single piece of metal swinging in the fluorescent light. One tag. The medic she couldn't save. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. The security officers flanked her, not aggressively, just present. A physical statement that she was no longer part of this place. They walked her through the ICU corridor, past the nursing stations where staff suddenly became very focused on their computers. Past the break room where the coffee was always cold and the fluorescent lights always buzzed like they were trying to warn everyone about something. Past the supply closets and medication rooms and all the places where she'd worked herself into exhaustion, trying to be good enough, careful enough, invisible enough. The parking garage at 11 p.m. smelled like oil and rain. Her car sat in the same spot where she'd parked it 14 hours earlier, when she still had a job. When she still had a future. She got in. She sat in the dark. She turned off the engine that was already dead and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The medically discharged major. The one with the shattered left leg that would ache for the rest of her life. The one who had lost 2 team members in the blast that had sent her home. She'd spent 12 years rebuilding herself into someone safe. Someone anonymous. Someone who could walk through a hospital and be nothing more than a competent pair of hands. Someone who could watch people suffer and help them without anyone ever knowing where that skill had come from. And now everyone knew. Or they would, soon enough. The Admiral would recover. The Admiral would talk. The Admiral's son was currently serving under his command, and by tomorrow or the next day that son would hear the story of how a nurse had saved his commanding officer's life. And then it would spread the way these things do, through the military network, through Pentagon phone lines, through classified briefings where people made notes about former Major Brooke Sullivan, USN Reserve, and what she'd been doing in Portland, Oregon, working night shifts in a hospital for half of what a civilian surgeon made. She'd run from one war zone and found another. The difference was that in Helmand, at least the enemy had the courtesy to announce themselves with explosions. Here in Portland, they just moved quietly through hospital corridors and rewrote your personnel files and made carefully worded phone calls to people with authority. She reached for her phone. 7 missed calls from her son. Ensign Michael Sullivan, serving aboard USS Leson under Admiral Hartwell's command. She couldn't call him back. What would she say? That she'd lost her job? That a doctor had weaponized hospital policy against her? That the one thing she'd been trying to keep hidden had probably just been exposed by the very man she'd saved? The rain started then, heavy and sudden, hammering the windshield like it was trying to break through. Brooke sat in the darkness of that parking garage and let the rain do what she wouldn't allow herself to do. Let something wash over her. Let something overwhelming carry her away. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The footsteps came first. Boots on tile. Precise. Military cadence. Lieutenant James Sullivan wore his navy dress blues like they were made for him, which they were. 3 generations of his family had worn that same uniform, and now he stood in the Oak Creek Memorial lobby at 6:08 a.m. with his jaw set the way his mother's jaw set when she was about to dismantle someone's entire understanding of reality. He found Dr. Caldwell in his corner office on the 3rd floor. The secretary tried to stop him. He didn't slow down. Caldwell looked up from his desk, irritated at first, then calculating as he registered the uniform. People in uniforms usually meant paperwork. Liability reviews. Not threats. You suspended Major Sullivan. The lieutenant's voice was soft. The worst kind of soft. The kind that comes before thunder. Caldwell's face shifted, a flash of something like relief, as if this were a conversation he could win with the right administrative language. I'm sure you understand the complexity of hospital credentialing requirements. When irregularities are discovered in an employee's background. Irregularities. The lieutenant took one step forward. Just one. Sir, do you know what she was doing when you were writing that suspension notice? Caldwell didn't answer. He didn't need to. The security guard who had escorted Brooke out the previous evening had already reported seeing her sitting in her car in the parking garage for 3 hours, not moving, not crying, just staring at nothing with her forehead against the steering wheel. The intercom on Caldwell's desk crackled. Dr. Caldwell, we need you in administration. They've called an emergency board meeting. The color drained from his face in stages. First his cheeks. Then his lips. Then something deeper, the color of a man watching his carefully constructed world develop a hairline fracture that was spreading faster than he could follow. He stood. His hands trembled. Actually trembled. The lieutenant noted this with the same clinical precision his mother had taught him, the same precision she'd used to catalog which parts of a human body could still function when everything else had failed. Downstairs, in the administration conference room, IT had pulled the file. Everything. the security clearance flag had triggered an automated protocol, the kind that existed specifically for situations where someone had been making decisions about a person cleared above their comprehension level. A SEAL Team 3 petty officer stood in the corner, call sign Breaker, 22 years in, silver beard like steel wool, the kind of presence that made air pressure change. He'd flown in from San Diego when he got the call. Behind him stood an FBI liaison from the Portland field office, a woman with a face like carved stone and a credential folder that made Caldwell's mouth go dry. "Dr. Caldwell," the liaison said, her voice like a hammer wrapped in velvet, "let's talk about your investigation into Major Sullivan's credentials." The silence was the kind that exists in surgical theaters when everyone realizes something has gone catastrophically wrong. Breaker stepped forward. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from a man who's given orders under fire. "I served with Major Sullivan. Helmand Province, 2012. She was a field surgeon. Let me read you what she did." Caldwell tried to speak. Nothing came out. Bronze Star with Valor. Breaker's eyes didn't leave Caldwell's face. For maintaining a forward aid station under sustained small arms fire and mortar rounds while treating and evacuating wounded personnel. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Purple Heart. Breaker didn't pause. Shrapnel from an IED that killed 2 Marines she was trying to save. She worked another 7 hours after getting hit. Didn't mention it until someone noticed blood soaking through her uniform. A nurse standing in the hallway outside the glass walls pressed her hand to her mouth. "And a Navy Cross," Breaker said, and now his voice carried something that wasn't anger exactly, but something deeper, the weight of witnessing courage the way a geologist witnesses stone. "For holding that field hospital alone for 11 hours under siege conditions while evacuating 63 Marines to the transport birds. Alone. While you were still in your residency, Dr. Caldwell, this woman was making triage decisions at 24 years old that saved lives. Multiple lives. The kind of lives you'll never have to account for." The FBI liaison opened the folder. "Your investigation, Dr. Caldwell, was triggered by a classified security clearance review. Major Sullivan's medical discharge, the one you cited in your suspension notice as evidence of instability, was part of a cover story. She's been doing intelligence consultation work with NCIS and the Defense Intelligence Agency for the past 11 years. Caldwell's hands were shaking now. Visibly. The tremor you see in people who've just realized they've made a terrible, irreversible mistake. "Her clearance level is above yours," the FBI liaison said, "which means she had no obligation to tell you anything about her background. You built an entire insubordination case against a person with a Naval Cross because she corrected your medication order. In front of a Navy Admiral. Who, incidentally, just completed a formal statement about your performance during his cardiac emergency. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass. The Admiral says you froze," the liaison continued. "He says Major Sullivan saved his life. He also says she's saved his life before, in ways he can't discuss in this room. What he can discuss is your competence. Or lack thereof." Caldwell looked for words. There were none. The liaison opened a second folder. This one was thicker. "Our review also uncovered some interesting patterns in your billing records. Medicare submissions for procedures that don't match your surgical schedules. Patient files that were altered after initial documentation. Board decisions that suspiciously coincided with complaints being withdrawn. We're going to turn this over to the Oregon Medical Board, the DEA, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. You should probably call a lawyer." Security escorted him out at 7:33 a.m. Through the glass walls of the administration office, Brooke watched him pass. She sat in a chair in the hallway in her dress uniform, medals worn correctly, her bearing like a flagpole in a storm. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Her single measured breath and the way her eyes tracked him, like a sniper's scope measuring distance, said everything. When he saw her sitting there in uniform, something in Caldwell's face broke. Not rage. Not defiance. Understanding. The terrible, suffocating understanding that he'd spent the last 72 hours destroying himself with such precision that it would take a forensic accountant just to catalogue the damage. He kept walking. He had no choice. Security had his arm. Brooke didn't move until he was gone. Then she closed her eyes. Breathed. The single dog tag beneath her dress uniform felt lighter than it had in 6 months. 6 months later, she stood in her dress blues at Naval Base San Diego. Her son wore his dress uniform beside her, and Admiral James Hartwell, fully recovered, his color back, his authority restored, clasped her son's shoulder as he pinned on the captain's bars. "I want to recognize someone," the Admiral said. His voice carried across the parade ground. Families turned. Sailors at attention held their focus. "Major Sullivan saved my life twice. Once on an operating table at Oak Creek Memorial when a civilian doctor froze. And before that, in Helmand Province, when her field hospital was the only thing between my Marines and casualty counts that would have broken something in me that I'm not sure could be repaired." Brooke's hand went to her throat. The single dog tag on its broken chain. The one that belonged to Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Chen, the medic who died in her arms trying to stop the bleeding from an artery her hands couldn't reach in time. 11 years she'd carried that weight. 11 years she'd thought it meant failure. Standing there in the California sun with her son in his captain's uniform and an admiral's recognition of work she'd done when the world wasn't watching, it finally felt like something else. Like a promise kept. Driving back through Portland 3 weeks later, she saw the strip mall on Division Street. And there, through the window of a storefront with a handwritten sign reading "Free Insurance Quotes," was Dr. Caldwell. He sat at a folding table with laminated brochures. His suit was cheaper than she remembered. His face was older. There was a coffee ring on his desk calendar from 2019. He looked up as a customer entered. Didn't see her. Wouldn't have recognized her anyway. In her civilian clothes, without the uniform, she was just another woman driving past. Just a nurse going home. That evening, back at Oak Creek Memorial where she'd been reinstated as clinical director of emergency medicine, she gathered the night shift for briefing. The room had changed. The same fluorescent lights, the same monitors, the same tile, but the weight of it was different now. Lighter. Like the air after a wound finally closes. A young RN approached hesitantly after the briefing. The same one who used to leave the break room when Brooke sat down. "Major Sullivan, I wanted to apologize for." Brooke shook her head. "You did what felt safe. I understand that." She looked around at the faces watching her. Some ashamed. Some awed. All uncertain about this new version of their colleague, the one they'd whispered about as a floor nurse, the one they'd abandoned, the one who'd come back with medals on her dress uniform and a clarity in her eyes that made them uncomfortable. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Brooke said quietly. "Let's get to work." And they did. Because that's what heroes do when the world stops watching. They don't wait for recognition. They don't need their medals pinned on by admirals. They just keep moving toward the next person who needs saving, the next emergency, the next chance to do what they were trained to do. The room emptied. Brooke pulled up her patient roster for the night shift. 63 patients. Same number she'd evacuated in Helmand. Different theater. Same gravity. She logged into the system and got ready to work. Have you ever underestimated someone based on their title or position, only to discover they were carrying strength you couldn't see? Tell me in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if you've known someone who served quietly without ever asking for recognition, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us.